The way my parents parented was very much like, we don't fight around the kids. We don't ever say anything around them. There was no, like, we didn't know anything.
Riley Keough has spent her entire life living inside one of the most storied, mythologized, and intensely scrutinized families in entertainment history. As the granddaughter of Elvis Presley, she inherited not just a name, she inherited a legacy so massive it casts a shadow across every major decision she makes, every project she takes on, every relationship she chooses to make public. But there's something deeper than the fame, something that's lived in the quiet corners of family conversations for decades. A truth that wasn't whispered because it was shameful, but because it was complicated, because it was human. Because sometimes the most profound secrets are protected by love, not deception. For years, Riley navigated her career and her personal life while carrying knowledge that the world didn't have. She watched her family maintain careful distance from a particular person, and she understood why. Or at least, she thought she did. But understanding something intellectually and confronting it face to face are two entirely different things. That gap between knowledge and reality, that's where the tension lives. That's where secrets become unbearable. The Presley family, for all its glamour and legendary status, has always been a family like any other in one critical way: it protects its own. When scandal threatens, when uncomfortable truths emerge, when the line between public perception and private reality becomes too blurry, the family circles inward. They make decisions about who gets to know what, and they commit to those boundaries with the kind of intensity that only families can muster. For Riley, this meant growing up understanding that some conversations belonged in private rooms, some people existed in a gray space between acknowledgement and denial, and some relationships couldn't be explained to the outside world without risking everything the family had worked to maintain. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have an expiration date. They exist in a kind of suspended animation, preserved, protected, but never actually resolved. They sit there in the family's collective consciousness, acknowledged in glances and silences, carried like an invisible weight that everyone feels but nobody publicly addresses. And then, something shifts. A moment arrives where maintaining the secret becomes harder than revealing it, where the emotional toll of protection exceeds the cost of truth. This is the story of that moment. This is about what happened when Riley Keough faced something her family had been managing from a distance, when she looked directly into the eyes of a man whose very existence had been treated as something that needed to be handled, contained, and kept from the mainstream narrative of her family's history. The reaction she had, the one that went viral, the one that thousands of people saw and instantly recognized as genuine, unfiltered, and deeply human. That reaction wasn't just about meeting someone for the first time. It was about finally allowing herself to feel something she'd been holding at arm's length for years. The question that everyone's asking now is simple but loaded. What does that reaction mean? What did Riley see when she looked at this man? What emotion crossed her face that made people stop scrolling, stop talking, and just feel the weight of something they couldn't quite name? The answer to that question doesn't exist in tabloid speculation or secondhand commentary. It exists in understanding who Riley is, what she's been carrying, and what it means when you finally stop carrying it alone. For decades, one name existed in the Presley family's internal universe in a way that outsiders couldn't quite grasp: Bob Joyce. Not a household name, not someone the general public would recognize. But within the family, within the spaces where real conversations happen, he represented something that required constant, exhausting management. He represented a connection to Elvis that didn't fit neatly into the official narrative. He represented complicated love, complicated loyalty, and complicated history. He was the man that few people outside the family even knew existed, and the fact that Riley was meeting him or seeing him for the first time in a meaningful way meant that something fundamental had shifted. You have to understand what it's like to grow up in a family where certain people are acknowledged only through implication, where you learn to read the silence around particular names with the same attention that other people read explicit conversation. Riley would have known about Bob Joyce the way you know about a ghost story passed down through generations. You know it exists. You know it matters. You know it shaped your family. But you don't talk about it directly, and you certainly don't ask uncomfortable questions about it in spaces where the wrong people might overhear. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Growing up under the Presley name meant understanding that the world owned pieces of your family that your family would never fully own themselves. It meant understanding that explanation often felt more dangerous than silence. And it meant understanding that there were people who mattered. People who had genuine connections to the legacy you carried, who had been deemed too complicated, too risky, or too spiritually significant to be incorporated into the public-facing story. Bob Joyce was one of those people. He was a connection to Elvis that couldn't be easily categorized, easily explained, or easily presented to the world without opening doors to questions nobody in the family was prepared to answer. But what that years-long silence actually accomplished was to make the moment when it finally broke even more powerful. When Riley eventually came face-to-face with Bob Joyce in a way that mattered, in a way that couldn't be managed or controlled or explained away, something shifted in her. You could see it. The world could see it. And that visibility, that unguarded, authentic moment of recognition became the thing that finally gave the secret permission to stop being a secret. To understand Riley's reaction, you first have to understand who Bob Joyce is. And more importantly, what his existence has meant to the Presley family for all these years. This isn't a scandal waiting to be exposed. It's not some hidden, illegitimate child or forbidden affair that the family was desperately trying to suppress. Bob Joyce's story is far more nuanced than that, and in many ways, far more complicated than simple tabloid drama could ever capture. Bob Joyce is a gospel singer and preacher, a man whose life has been dedicated to faith, music, and spirituality. He's someone who, by all accounts, has lived a quiet, purposeful existence far removed from the entertainment industry machinery that defines so much of the Presley family's identity. He's not a celebrity chasing headlines. He's not someone who benefited from the Presley name or tried to capitalize on any connection to the legacy. In fact, Bob Joyce has spent decades deliberately staying out of the spotlight, living a life that contradicts everything the entertainment world might suggest he should be doing if he were trying to leverage any connection to one of the most famous families in American history. The connection between Bob Joyce and the Presley family is spiritual and personal rather than sensational. He's been described as someone who shared deep conversations with Elvis, someone who understood aspects of Elvis's inner world that few people could access. In some circles, there's been quiet discussion about whether Bob Joyce might share more than just a spiritual connection to Elvis, whether there might be biological ties that the family has never publicly acknowledged. But even if that were true, and even if the family has chosen not to make that official, the real story isn't about genetics or paternity tests. It's about a man who represented something meaningful to Elvis, and who by extension represented something meaningful to the people Elvis loved. The significance of Bob Joyce in Elvis's life wasn't something that emerged from tabloid gossip or casual observation. People who were genuinely close to Elvis during his later years have described Bob Joyce as a stabilizing presence, someone who offered spiritual guidance when Elvis was searching for meaning beyond the noise of fame and excess. This wasn't a transactional relationship. This wasn't someone trying to get close to a celebrity for personal gain. This was a human connection rooted in shared spiritual curiosity, in genuine conversation, and in a kind of understanding that transcends the usual hierarchies of fame and influence. Elvis, for all his legendary status, was still a man looking for authentic connection. Bob Joyce apparently offered him something in that direction. For Riley's generation of the Presley family, Bob Joyce would have been a figure who existed in a peculiar space. He wasn't someone they could publicly celebrate or acknowledge without opening doors to questions they weren't prepared to answer. He wasn't someone they could entirely ignore, because ignoring him meant denying part of Elvis's story. So he existed in this careful middle ground, respected, perhaps even loved, but kept at a distance from the public-facing narrative of the family. The protocols around Bob Joyce would have been understood implicitly. He was someone you knew about, someone you might encounter at certain family functions, but someone whose role and significance remained deliberately vague to the outside world. The reason for this distance was strategic, yes, but it was also protective. Not protective of the family's reputation in the way cynical observers might assume, but protective of something more fundamental. The Presley family has always understood that Elvis's life was examined under a microscope unlike almost any other public figure in modern history. Every relationship he had, every person who claimed closeness to him, every spiritual advisor or friend became material for speculation, analysis, and often exploitation. By keeping Bob Joyce away from the public eye, the family was protecting him from that same machinery. They were protecting his privacy, his spiritual work, and his dignity as a human being who never asked to be part of the entertainment world's endless appetite for Elvis-adjacent content. But protection through silence has a cost that accumulates over time. It means that alternative explanations can flourish in the spaces left by absence. It means that absence itself becomes a kind of presence, something people notice and try to fill in with their own theories, their own interpretations, their own assumptions. When you deliberately keep someone out of the narrative, you create a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. The questions grow. The speculation intensifies. The mystery becomes bigger than any truth you might have chosen to share. And it means that when a moment finally arrives where the carefully maintained distance can't be preserved, the emotional impact is magnified exponentially. Because what people are really reacting to isn't just the meeting itself. They're reacting to the breaking of a pattern, the acknowledgement of something that had been deliberately kept separate, and the vulnerable moment when someone has to face a reality they've been managing from a distance. For Riley specifically, knowing about Bob Joyce would have meant carrying a particular kind of burden. She knew something the world didn't. She understood a dimension of her grandfather's life and spiritual, seeking that the public narrative of Elvis Presley had no room for. She carried this knowledge while also carrying the family's explicit or implicit understanding that this knowledge wasn't hers to share, that it belonged in private spaces, that it needed to remain protected from public interpretation and commodification. This kind of secret knowledge shapes you differently than other family dynamics. It creates a relationship with truth that's complicated and careful. You learn to hold multiple versions of reality simultaneously: the public version that everyone sees, the private version that your family maintains, and your own internal version that tries to reconcile the two. You learn that sometimes loyalty means keeping quiet. You learn that sometimes love means not asking questions. And you learn that the weight of that knowledge, carried silently year after year, accumulates in ways you don't fully understand until you finally have to confront the person at the center of the secret. Bob Joyce represented all of this for Riley. He was the embodied answer to questions she'd learned not to ask. He was the proof that her grandfather's story was larger and more complicated than the world had been allowed to understand. And when she finally saw him, when that moment arrived that would be captured and shared across the internet, she was confronting not just a person, but the dissolution of a protective fiction that her family had maintained for decades. The encounter between Riley Keough and Bob Joyce unfolded in a way that felt almost inevitable in retrospect. Though nobody could have predicted it would become the kind of moment that stops people mid-scroll. It happened in a space that was neither entirely public nor entirely private, that liminal territory, where family moments sometimes become something more when cameras are present, or when someone nearby captures something genuine and decides the world should see it. The setting itself was significant. This wasn't a carefully orchestrated family reunion designed for maximum emotional impact. This was something more organic, more uncontrolled, and therefore more real. What made this particular moment different from decades of careful family management was that Riley couldn't prepare for it in the way her family had trained her to prepare for public appearances and media scrutiny. You can script an interview. You can manage a red carpet moment. You can control your facial expressions and your tone when you know the camera is there and the question is coming. But when you encounter someone face to face, when recognition happens in real time, when the person you've only known through family whispers and carefully maintained distance suddenly stands in front of you, that's when the carefully constructed walls start to crack. Riley's initial reaction registered across her face in a way that transcended whatever words might have been exchanged. There was surprise, absolutely, but it was the kind of surprise that comes when intellectual knowledge finally becomes embodied reality. She knew who Bob Joyce was. She had carried that knowledge her entire adult life. But knowing about someone and actually seeing them are fundamentally different experiences. When she looked at him, when recognition moved across her features, she was experiencing something that no amount of family preparation could have fully readied her for. This was a man who had known her grandfather in ways she never would. This was a living connection to a figure who had shaped her entire existence before she was born. What people witnessed in that captured moment was the visible dissolution of the boundary between private knowledge and public acknowledgement. Her eyes told a story that no carefully constructed statement could have conveyed. They told the story of someone who had spent years managing information about this man, who had learned to hold his existence at a careful distance, and who was finally allowing herself to simply respond to him as a human being rather than as a symbol that needed to be controlled or contained. There was vulnerability in that moment. There was the recognition of something significant happening in real time. The most remarkable aspect of what occurred was its authenticity in an era where so much of celebrity is meticulously curated. In a world where reactions are managed and emotions are filtered through the lens of public relations strategy, where every statement is workshopped and every appearance is choreographed, this moment refused to be anything other than genuine. Riley didn't perform for the camera. She didn't construct a narrative about what this encounter meant. She didn't calculate how her response would be interpreted or what it might communicate to the public. She simply experienced it, and that experience was visible in every gesture, every expression, every second of hesitation before recognition fully bloomed across her face. People watching that video could sense immediately that they were seeing something real. They could distinguish between the currency of manufactured emotion and the weight of authentic feeling. They could tell that this wasn't a staged moment designed to generate headlines or control a narrative. This was a woman confronting something significant and allowing that confrontation to be visible to the world. In an era where transparency is weaponized and authenticity is often just another marketing tool, genuine emotion cuts through everything else. It demands attention. It demands interpretation. It demands that people feel something rather than simply consume content. The physical response that accompanied her emotional reaction was equally important. The movement toward him carried its own significance. It suggested acceptance. It suggested recognition not just of who he was, but of what he meant. There was no hesitation in that movement that suggested fear or rejection. Instead, there was something that looked like relief, the relief that comes when you finally stop pretending you don't know what you actually know, when you stop maintaining a fiction and allow yourself to acknowledge reality. What people were witnessing in that moment extended far beyond the simple mechanics of two people meeting. They were witnessing the breaking of a family pattern that had persisted for decades. For all those years, the Presley family had managed the narrative around Bob Joyce through omission, through careful distance, through the implicit agreement that some connections existed but didn't need to be publicly acknowledged. They had maintained this boundary through sheer force of will, through consistent messaging, through the understanding that certain people and certain relationships belonged in the private chambers of family life rather than in the public sphere. Riley's reaction shattered that agreement. By allowing herself to be seen responding to him with genuine emotion, she was communicating something that no official statement could have conveyed. The significance of that moment extended into the hours and days following its initial capture. What people were really reacting to wasn't just the encounter itself. They were reacting to what the encounter represented. They were reacting to the visible proof that secrets have limits, that carefully maintained boundaries eventually dissolve under the pressure of human truth, that authenticity possesses a power that no amount of strategic silence can ultimately contain. The questions that exploded across social media in the aftermath were inevitable. Who was this man? What was his relationship to Elvis? Why had the family never publicly acknowledged him before? Why was Riley's reaction so visibly emotional if this was just a casual family acquaintance? The questions themselves became a kind of pressure, a force that made it impossible for the family to maintain the status quo. Once the public had seen Riley's genuine response, once they'd felt the weight of emotion in that moment, once they'd recognized the markers of something significant happening, the old patterns of silence and careful distance stopped functioning the way they had for so long. The viral nature of the moment amplified everything. It didn't just document a private family encounter, it made that encounter public in a way that couldn't be walked back or reframed. It created a permanent record of authenticity that would forever change how people understood the Presley family's relationship to their own history. And for Riley specifically, it marked a turning point, a moment where she chose vulnerability over control, where she allowed genuine feeling to supersede the careful management that her family name demanded. What the Riley Keough moment ultimately exposes is something much larger than a single family's private dynamics. It reveals the fundamental tension that defines the entire Presley legacy, the constant negotiation between what is true and what can be publicly acknowledged, between honoring Elvis's memory and controlling the narrative around his life, between protecting privacy and maintaining the transparency that modern celebrity culture demands. This isn't a new conflict. It's been embedded in the Presley story since the moment Elvis became more myth than man, more icon than individual. Elvis Presley's life has been subjected to more scrutiny, more analysis, more mythologizing, and more outright fabrication than almost any other cultural figure in modern history. Every relationship he had, every spiritual advisor he consulted, every moment of crisis or redemption has been examined, re-examined, and interpreted through dozens of competing lenses. The people closest to him, his family, his friends, his confidants have had to navigate an impossible situation where simply existing in proximity to him makes you a character in everyone else's story. You become material for interpretation. Your private moments become public property. Your genuine connections to him become subject to endless speculation and reinterpretation. Bob Joyce represents something specific in that landscape. He represents the people who were genuinely close to Elvis, who offered him something real rather than something transactional, who understood him as a spiritual seeker rather than as the icon the world had constructed him to be. And by keeping Bob Joyce deliberately distant from the public narrative, by maintaining a protective silence around his relationship to Elvis, the Presley family was making a statement about what they valued. They were saying that some relationships were too sacred, too personal, too genuine to be turned into content or fodder for endless speculation. They were protecting something real from the machinery of celebrity that had already consumed so much of Elvis's authentic self. But what Riley's moment suggests is that this protection has a shelf life. There's only so long that a family can maintain a divide between what they know privately and what the world is allowed to see before the gap becomes untenable. There's only so long that genuine human connections can be managed through strategic silence before the suppression itself becomes the story. The truth about Bob Joyce, whatever its specifics might be, was always going to emerge eventually, because truth, real, human, authentic truth, has a tendency to assert itself regardless of how carefully we try to contain it. You can delay truth, you can obscure it, you can frame it differently, but you can't ultimately prevent it from finding its way into the world. What the viral moment reveals about Riley specifically is that she's someone who has had enough of living on the carefully controlled side of that divide. She's built her career on choosing her own path, on being selective about what parts of her family legacy she engages with, on refusing to be defined entirely by her connection to Elvis, by allowing herself to have a genuine reaction to Bob Joyce, by refusing to perform an appropriate distance or strategic neutrality. She was claiming more of that agency. She was saying that she got to decide what was true about her own family, and she was willing to let that truth be visible to anyone paying attention. This moment also raises important questions about the nature of loyalty and love within families that exist under extraordinary public scrutiny. When you're a member of a famous family, the duty to protect the family narrative can feel absolute. You're raised with the understanding that what happens inside the family stays inside the family, that unified public messaging is crucial to survival, that individual emotional truth sometimes has to be subordinated to collective strategic interest. Parents teach this to their children not out of deception, but out of protection. They've seen what happens when family secrets become tabloid fodder. They understand the price of vulnerability in a world that treats private pain as entertainment. But as Riley's reaction demonstrates, this subordination of individual truth to collective strategy has a cost that accumulates over time. It costs authenticity. It costs the opportunity to be fully honest about what you actually feel and think. It costs the possibility of genuine connection with people in your own family story. And eventually, it costs the ability to maintain the fiction because the human need for truth eventually overwhelms even the most carefully constructed walls of silence. The Presley legacy has always been about managing impossible contradictions. Elvis was a spiritual man and a man who struggled with addiction. He was devoted to family and capable of infidelity. He was profoundly connected to African American musical traditions while existing as a white man who benefited from racial privilege. He was seeking transcendence while caught in the machinery of exploitation and excess. He was deeply faithful and deeply flawed. He was larger than life and desperately human. These contradictions can't be resolved, but they can be acknowledged. And in acknowledging them, we actually honor his humanity more than we do by smoothing them into a coherent narrative that erases the complexity. Bob Joyce's place in that narrative, whether acknowledged or not, is part of this larger story of contradiction and complexity. He's evidence that Elvis was looking for spiritual guidance, genuine connection, and understanding beyond what the fame machinery could provide. He's evidence that there were people in Elvis's life who cared about him for who he was rather than what he represented. He's evidence that Elvis's interior life was richer and more searching than the public mythology allows. And by trying to keep that relationship separate from the public narrative, the family was trying to protect something pure from corruption. But the attempt itself created a different kind of problem. It created the appearance of something being hidden, something being managed, something being denied. It created space for speculation to flourish. It created questions that silence couldn't answer. It created the very kind of narrative confusion that the protective impulse was trying to prevent. Riley's moment of authenticity cracks that facade and allows something different to emerge. It allows the possibility that you can acknowledge important people in your family history while still respecting their privacy. It allows the possibility that truth and protection aren't mutually exclusive. It allows the possibility that sometimes the most powerful thing a family can do is stop managing the narrative and start being honest about what actually matters. It suggests that transparency about the genuine connections in your life doesn't necessarily mean exploiting those relationships or turning them into content. Looking forward, the question is what happens now? Does the family find a new way of relating to Bob Joyce's place in their history? Do they allow for more genuine, unfiltered acknowledgement of people and relationships that have previously existed in carefully controlled shadows? Or do they attempt to reestablish the boundary, to find new ways of managing the narrative, to protect the carefully constructed image that has defined them for so long? Whatever happens next, that moment between Riley and Bob Joyce has changed something fundamental. It's demonstrated that secrets can be managed and contained only for so long. It's shown that genuine emotion, when allowed to be visible, has the power to shift how entire families relate to their own history. And it's suggested that maybe, just maybe, the Presley legacy could become something even more powerful, not the story of a family controlling and protecting a narrative, but the story of a family brave enough to acknowledge all the complicated truths that make their history real and human and worth preserving. If you found this story compelling, subscribe now and hit the bell. You won't find these untold Presley revelations anywhere else. Share this with someone who understands complicated family legacies. Family histories are always more human than the headlines suggest, and there's so much more to discover. Don't miss it.